Okay, I think we're going to get started. I'm Debbie Liu, the Associate Director of E-Cig, and I wanted to welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on E-Cig. So for those of you who don't know E-Cig, the Energy Systems Integration Group is a membership-based nonprofit organization. We provide members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities to support renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. And we do this through workshops and tutorials and blogs and webinars like this. And we produce technical resource materials through task forces and working groups. E-Cig also serves in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST. And GPST's mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and scale. E-Cig leads one of the 5 pillars that deals with research agendas for system operators, and you can get more information on GPST at globalpst.org. So we've been very busy here at E-Cig in spite of COVID. We finished up the forecasting and markets workshop in June, and we're about to start the fall technical workshop in October. And all of this is open to everyone. And this is free, so please register anytime on the E-Cig website. If you are new to E-Cig, I encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear. You can go to the website ecig.energy or follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. So a few logistical matters before we get started. Everyone's lines are going to be muted. And for questions and comments, we've gone to the Slido platform. So go to slido.com and use the event code E-Cig15. Instructions are shown at the bottom of the screen. You can type in your questions there. You can also vote for questions that others have asked that you like, and we'll use that to help us prioritize questions at the end. We plan to save 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. And for those questions that don't get answered because we might run out of time, we will post answers after the webinar. So don't be afraid to ask questions through the Slido platform. So today, we're going to be talking about integration of the distribution and transmission systems. This is Dr. Fritz Karl's grand unification theory for the power systems. It's a very timely topic. You all may know FERC Order 2222 was issued a year ago to open organized wholesale markets to aggregations of DERs. RTOs have been working to determine the rules to support DER participation in the marketplace. And then outside of the organized markets, sort of like let 100 flowers bloom in terms of the diversity of approaches of utilities from Holy Cross Energy to, Arizona Public Service and others. Now, Dr. Fritz Karl is our speaker today. I've been really lucky to have worked with Fritz through the Pacific Energy Institute and more recently in our DER working group activities that are examining the open networks programs, the UK and Australia, and how lessons from that can be applied in the US, and coordinated T&D operations and planning, and how we might think about these systems working together, being integrated more tightly. So I personally have always been impressed by Fritz's thoughtful and holistic systems approach to what the grid of the future might look like and how it might work across planning to operations, market design, customer experiences, the regulatory framework, retail rates. And Fritz is going to examine all of this and more as we consider how we better integrate the T&D systems. So Fritz is an independent consultant. He teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of San Francisco, and he's worked on many different aspects and scales of electricity systems in many different regions, the US, China, Europe, and India, for example. He got his PhD at the famous Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley, and his BA from the College of William and Mary in philosophy. So I always knew Fritz was a deep thinker, but now I know where he gets it from. And I think you're going to see some of that woven into the talk today. So just a short reminder again, use slido.com and the event code E-Cig15 to ask questions. Okay, so I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Fritz Karl.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So my task for today was to provide a somewhat more philosophical angle on the question of how we integrate distribution level resources with the bulk power system in its wholesale market. So hence the title. This was really meant to appeal to your more philosophy of physics side and do some general mood setting. But it nicely sets up the question that I want to dive into today. If we're going to be building out generation and storage resources on both the electric distribution and transmission systems over the coming decades, how do we better integrate these systems so that they function more as a unified whole? This talk is going to be more like an exploratory essay and not our report on the results of a structured analysis. My goal is to do some framing and identify some things to think about, but not lay out definitive answers. And if you come out of this with more questions than you had when you came in, then I probably have succeeded. I'm going to focus on the US, but some of the discussion will be more general as well. I'll try to talk for around 35, 40 minutes, hopefully less, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So I'm going to start by giving a quick plug for some work that I've been involved in with E-Cig that's related, but not necessarily a core focus of our topic today. I'll start with then some historical context on two seemingly contradictory and incompatible trends in the US. First, greater physical and interconnection and regionalization of electricity supply through transmission expansion. One day this could mean, for instance, that someone in California could buy wind power from someone in Iowa. Second, greater localization of resources, meaning specifically an increase in generation and storage resources located on the distribution system. I'll use these two trends to set up distribution and transmission integration as a problem that we need to solve. I'll propose 4 principles for how we might better integrate the distribution and transmission systems and walk through examples, some examples of what these principles might mean in practice. And then I'll close by discussing some priority areas for changes in regulation and markets that would promote better integration of the transmission and distribution systems. I'm going to use the term integration very, very loosely. I'm not using it to mean that we have a single system operator or regulator for the entire electricity system or even standardized institutions across the US. Instead, I'm using integration to mean the coordination mechanisms that would allow the distribution and transmission systems to operate as if they were more like a single integrated system. So first, the plug for E-Cig, the E-Cig Open Networks project. As Debbie noted earlier this year, E-Cig embarked on a project to try to understand what an open networks concept might look like in the US. As many of you know, both Australia and the UK have organized stakeholder processes around open networks. And with the release of FERC Order 2222 and other recent DER goings on, the timing seemed to be right to explore this open networks concept in a US context. The project has a few different components, one more focused on what kinds of changes we need to enable the wholesale market integration of DER in the near term. One component more focused on translating the Australia-UK experience to a US context, what's relevant and interesting from that experience. And then a final component focused on the broader question of how we might envision this open networks concept being applied in the US. E-Cig is going to have some public events related to the project later in the year, so I'm going to limit my overview to there, but I did want to put this on your radar. Some of what I'll talk about today has evolved from discussions in this project, but I'll give my disclaimer about this presentation being my own opinions and not reflecting those of my colleagues. Okay. Oops. So let's start with the whirlwind history around these two concepts of regionalization and localization in the US. I'm going to use the term regionalization to refer to greater physical and institutional interconnectedness of electricity systems, and localization to refer to the siting of resources closer to loads. And let me lead with a little bit of signposting so you get a sense of why I'm dragging you through history. First thing I want you to note is that people have been thinking about many of these questions around resource scale and network scope for a long time. And most of what I'll cover later in the talk is just going to be variations on some long-standing themes. The second thing to note is that in the US, we've had this wax and wane of interest in these two concepts of regionalization and localization over time. And I think what makes our current situation a bit more unique is that we have a significant amount of momentum behind both of these concepts at the same time. Okay, so let's dive in. So regionalization in the US, regionalization and self-generation actually emerged together around the turn of the 19th century, but for a variety of reasons, some economic, some regulatory, self-generation among industrial customers declined over the 20th century, and electricity systems became these more centralized systems that we're more familiar with today. Despite growing physical interconnection, institutional interconnection among electricity systems during this time period, the 1920s to roughly the 1970s, was still limited in scope and scale outside of perhaps the Eastern power pools. But even with limits in regional electricity exchange, what utilities were able to offer under this model was high reliability at low cost. But the magic of this model of industrial organization, you having utility dominant electricity systems with large central scale generating resources, started to run out of steam over the 1970s. As the magic wore off toward the end of the 1970s and over the 1980s, this idea of having more resources on the distribution system took hold again, initially through the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA, and later through utility demand side programs, including some net energy metering programs starting as early as the early 1980s. But in the 1990s, even as the idea of distributed resources came back into vogue, the policy focus shifted to more regionalization as FERC opened up the US transmission system through Order 888 in 1996. Order 888 was more focused on enabling regional wholesale transactions than competition per se. Was a somewhat fateful decision that we'll come back to later. But even so, it's hard to understate the impact of Order 888 on the US electricity industry. It provides the regulatory market infrastructure for a municipal utility in Wisconsin, for instance, to buy power from an underutilized power plant in Florida. I don't think this has ever happened, but in principle, it could. In the wake of Order 888, we have this, albeit somewhat gradual, shift from thinking about the electricity sector as a bunch of individual utilities that sometimes lean on each other for economics and reliability, to thinking more about larger, regionally interconnected systems and markets. But sometime later in the 2000s, with differences in timing across region, the momentum behind the regionalization of electricity supply and markets starts to fizzle out a bit, and the ISOs and RTOs turn inward to focus on improving their own market rules rather than enabling efficient regional markets for electricity. In general, over this 1990s to 2000s period, the distribution system was relatively quiet. One interesting idea that emerged over the 1990s that got somewhat limited traction was the notion that restructuring and competition in the electricity industry would lead to rapid growth in distributed generation. So there's a relatively, I wouldn't say large, but there's a significant number of EPRI publications from this time period that raised this possibility. At the time, the thinking was that this would be led by micro turbines and fuel cells as a result of low natural gas prices during the 1990s. But despite these anticipatory sort of this anticipatory thinking, adoption of distributed generation was relatively limited over the 1990s and earlier 2000s. Another important idea that surfaced in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly after the California electricity crisis, was the importance of price-responsive demand in making competitive electricity markets work. But this idea too gets short shrift over the 2000s, and later we decided that we can manage anti-competitive behavior through automatic offer mitigation and stronger regulation instead. And then lastly, many states decided for various reasons to eschew formal retail competition, which anchored in the hybrid electricity structure that we still have in most of the US today, where we have competitive wholesale markets on the one hand and largely regulated retail sectors on the other. But toward the end of the 2000s, a couple of important things happened on the demand side. First, the cost of solar PV began to fall precipitously, both for distributed scale and utility scale resources. Second, consumers started to realize that they could choose to produce their own renewable power at low or no added costs, in many cases supported by state policies. The resulting boom in rooftop PV adoption over the 2010s was relatively disruptive to the traditional utility business models in ways that had been talked about earlier in the 1990s. Disruption led to ongoing talk about grid defection and utility death spirals, and some ongoing soul searching by the industry as a whole. But it also leads to greater interest in resources, from generation to storage to load management on the distribution system, and this idea of having a more active distribution system with bidirectional flows of power. Over the 2010s, at the same time that distributed solar was disrupting the electricity industry, we also saw a rapid expansion of utility scale gas, wind, and solar connected to the transmission system, and the continued creation and expansion of regional electricity markets. The development of the Western Energy Imbalance Market in 2014, the creation of the SPP markets also in 2014, and the continued expansion of MISO and PJM. Anyone sitting outside and watching this kind of dizzying interaction of seemingly contradictory forces could be forgiven for thinking that the US electricity industry is headed for some form of a singularity, a collision between two models for electricity systems that are fundamentally incompatible. Which brings us back to the realm of the present. And again, I think what's unique about the present relative to history is that we have these seemingly contradictory trends toward localization and regionalization that are happening at the same time. Nowhere is this perhaps clearer than in California, where over the past decade we've had about 10 gigawatts of rooftop PV come online at the same time that we've had a significant regional expansion of the CalISO's real-time market. In reality, there's nothing fundamentally incompatible about localization and regionalization. The larger question is whether we can make them more compatible by better integrating the distribution and transmission systems. And again, interconnection here is meant to refer to coordination mechanisms that would allow the distribution and transmission systems to operate more as if they were a single integrated system. We've had a few efforts in the US at distribution and transmission integration, most notably probably through New York's reforming the energy vision process. And there are several new initiatives on the horizon. But in terms of getting our transmission and distribution systems to the point of operating as a more integrated whole, we're not quite there yet. The reason I think we need to get there, we need to bring the distribution and transmission systems closer together, is that we're likely to have continued momentum toward both localization and regionalization over the next decade, with differences across states. At a high level, localization and regionalization will even have many of the same drivers. For instance, resilience is a key driver of distributed PV and storage in places like California, but resilience is also a key driver of interest in regional transmission expansions to avoid situations like what happened in ERCOT earlier this year. Increasing flexibility is a key driver of interest in DERs, whether that's storage, EVs, or DR, or demand response, but it's also a key driver of new regional transmission to take advantage of greater regional diversity in loads and resources. If we can't figure out ways to better integrate the distribution and transmission systems, we'll end up with overbuilding or even maybe underbuilding of generation, storage, and network infrastructure on both the distribution and transmission systems, which will leave us with higher costs and lower reliability. There are no doubt some engineering challenges to having this more integrated electrical grid where we have power flowing to and from the distribution system, but I think the principal challenges of integration are regulatory and market. A useful lens for thinking about this integration problem, and probably the most important overarching question for our electricity systems of the future, is the question of where we put energy storage. Battery storage in particular is kind of the Swiss Army knife of electricity systems. We can connect it behind the meter, in front of the meter, connected to the primary distribution system or at a substation, at the sub-transmission level, at the transmission level, or behind the point of interconnection for a generation facility. My sense would be that in the future, we'll want to site storage all over our electricity systems, reflecting a different mix of local and system values. This will likely only happen if we can get to the point of having well-integrated transmission and distribution systems. So just as a flag, I'm going to use storage as an example in the rest of this presentation. I'll refer to our storage resource. This is our battery right here. This question, where do we put our battery? So how do we make changes in regulation and markets to better integrate the distribution and transmission systems? I'm going to use 4 integration principles to frame this question. The first principle is equivalent access and value, meaning that we should be able to locate resources where and operate them how they have the most value. The second is regulatory equivalence, meaning that our regulatory treatment of resources connecting to the distribution or transmission systems shouldn't unduly affect where we locate resources. Third is planning convergence, meaning that distribution and transmission planning should be well enough coordinated where we converge on consistent expansion plans for both distribution and transmission. And then the fourth is autonomy. And the idea here is that consumers and producers should be able to choose how they buy and sell power, that we continue to make space for decentralized decision making, but we ensure that costs and risks are appropriately allocated. I'm going to focus more on the first 2 of these, but I'll tangentially touch on planning convergence, and I'll weave in the autonomy principle throughout. Before we dive deeper into these, I want to quickly distinguish between customer, community, societal, and local and system wholesale value. The recent wildfire-related shutoffs in California provide a great illustration of the differences in these values. Customers may want to buy backup power supplies, for instance, PV plus batteries, to ensure they have power during shutoffs. That's customer value. A city that is part of a larger utility may also want to do so. That's community value. The state of California may also wish to support backup power supplies to keep parts of the distribution system energized when transmission lines are taken out of service. That's societal value from California's perspective, but it only reflects the societal value of one political entity. So California, but not Nevada, for instance. I'm going to call customer, community, and societal values individual values to reflect the fact that they may not be shared across different parties. Wholesale value, on the other hand, is common currency among everyone, regardless of their individual values. Wholesale value can be local if we have transmission constraints, or it can be regional or system. Without wholesale exchange, we end up with underutilized equipment and high costs. So for instance, if Californians just build a bunch of backup power that's used infrequently to deal with power shutoffs, this will lead to high costs in the same way that building combustion turbines to meet peak demand that occurs once every 5 years currently leads to high costs. But the PV and storage that Californians use for backup power, for instance, can be used to sell low-cost power to neighboring states and potentially one day even further afield, reducing the cost of building backup power. So a key dynamic in making localization and regionalization more compatible and in thinking about these 4 principles will be how can we enable individual value for one set of parties while also enabling wholesale value, wholesale exchange with another set of parties. I'll start with the notion of equivalent access and value. In most of the US, our storage resource will have 2 main pathways to getting paid. The first is in wholesale markets. The first is on the supply side. Our storage resource will could make supply offers into ISO capacity, energy, and ancillary services markets. The second option, the second pathway, is on the demand side by reducing demand for the transmission system, and in doing so, reducing ISO capacity, transmission, energy, and AS charges for load-serving entities, or energy and demand charges for direct access customers. So I'm going to use the phrase demand-side participation here to mean participation on the demand side of ISO markets. So this is not meant to mean participation of demand-side resources on the supply side of the ISO markets. Demand-side participation doesn't need to occur on ISO market timelines. So for instance, tariffs can shift loads off of system coincident peaks, reducing capacity and transmission charges and potentially distribution system costs. There are also some interesting hybrid options for dual participation resources that can participate on both the demand and the supply sides of ISO markets. For instance, reducing ISO capacity related charges for load serving entities and also participating in ISO energy markets. This equivalent access and value principle means that after we account for the different individual values of resources, resources should be agnostic about which of these pathways they choose. FERC Order 2222 brings us closer to equivalent access on the supply side. Almost any resource on the transmission or distribution system, if it chooses to do so, should be able to participate directly in ISO markets. But on the demand side, we're still a ways off from this principle. To get a bit more intuition for why, it's useful to go back to our storage lens. In the ISO markets, a 1 megawatt storage device will submit an offer curve in the day-ahead and real-time energy markets that looks something like this. In this case, if the market price is below $10 a megawatt hour, the device will charge. And if it's higher than $40 a megawatt hour, it will discharge. On the demand side, there are two ways to replicate what would happen with the supply side offer curve. The first would be through a load serving entity or LSE tariff that reflects expected ISO day ahead market prices. So the battery would charge during expected lower price hours and discharge during expected higher price hours. This would show up in the LSE forecast rather than explicitly in its demand bid. So to say that we have an LSE that's doing forecast bidding in the day ahead market with a flat forecasted load of 5 megawatts in each hour. This just has the hour ending 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. as illustrations. And let's say that this LSE offers a tariff to customers with distributed generation and storage, including our 1 megawatt battery that reflects ISO day ahead prices. Let's assume that this is a solar-rich ISO that has low prices during solar hours and higher prices during the evening net peak. So the LSE's tariff has low prices during the day and higher prices in the evening. Battery will charge during the day. Based on the tariff, the battery will charge during the day, say at 2 p.m., increasing the LSE's demand to 6 megawatts, and will discharge during the evening, say at 7 p.m., reducing the LSE's demand to 4 megawatts. As long as the LSE's tariffs reasonably reflect the ISO day-ahead market prices, the shifting gets captured in the forecast will be similar to what would have happened if the storage device participated directly in ISO markets on the supply side. With the right tariffs, we could do this first approach now. This is essentially the approach in New York's value of DER tariff. But in practice, most jurisdictions in the US don't have unbundled tariffs for distributed generation and storage that are tied to wholesale market prices. The second approach is by the LSE taking a bid from the storage facility and integrating it into its day-ahead bid curves for each hour. So let's take 7 p.m. as an example. The LSE's bid curve without storage would just be a vertical line at 5 megawatts. From the LSE's perspective, I'll pay any price up to the offer cap for 5 megawatts. So when we integrate the storage bid, the demand curve looks like this. I'll consume 6 megawatts if the price is less than $10 a megawatt, 5 megawatts if prices are between $10 and $40 a megawatt hour, and 4 megawatts if prices are higher than $40 a megawatt hour. All we're doing is taking a storage supply bid and integrating it into a demand bid. Other parameters in the supply bid may make the outcomes between supply and demand bids diverge. But in principle, they're just mirror reflections of one another, and they'll give you a similar result. For this second approach, to my knowledge, there are a few LSEs that actually do this, that integrate bids from DER customers or resources that they own and operate on the distribution system into their ISO demand bids. This requires a communications and market infrastructure between the LSE and the customer, or just for the LSE itself for LSE-owned resources that hasn't been widely rolled out. But as a quick digression, notice how much more friendly this approach is to demand response than trying to squeeze demand response into supply side bids through baselining and net benefits tests. On the demand side, through demand bids, we can have these more seamless aggregations of generation, storage, and demand response integrated into a single demand bid curve. Integrating generation, storage, and demand response resources into demand bids requires LSEs, either themselves or through service providers, to be more active participants in ISO markets. And this is a really critical issue for this equivalent and access and value principle. LSEs, and again, this is mostly utilities, have to see value in using distribution level generation, storage, and demand response to reduce their ISO market costs for this to really work. But there's another issue here in that demand side participation in ISO markets is limited to day ahead bidding at what will be, in most cases, aggregated locational marginal prices. By and large, the demand side does not actively participate in ISO real-time markets. The ISO's clear real-time markets using their own demand forecasts. Reductions in demand over the course of the operating day can reduce energy and AS market charges, but we don't allow demand to play much of a role in price formation for real-time energy. There's a long and as far as I know, unwritten history as to why, but regardless, the result is that we have wholesale markets that have a high degree of sophistication on the supply side, but more limited sophistication on the demand side. And instead, as with FERC 2222, we've been trying to create space for distributed energy resources to participate on the supply side, rather than trying to figure out how to design a better demand side in our wholesale markets. It may not be obvious why this matters, but here's a quick example. So say that in the day ahead market, the interval between 4 and 5 p.m. clears at $30 a megawatt hour. The ISO knows at 2 p.m. that there will be a transmission outage for the next 3 hours that will drive up real-time prices to more than $200 a megawatt hour. Per our previous example, there may have been demand bids from LSCs that would have been willing to reduce demand through DRR storage if prices were higher than $100 a megawatt hour. But the only way that the ISO can take advantage of these bids is if LSCs reduce their metered demand, which will only show up in price formation if it changes the ISO forecast. Note that taking advantage of real-time flexibility on the demand side doesn't require LSCs to change their bids in real time. It just means that ISOs can use LSC bids to clear markets intraday. Allowing loads to participate in price formation in the energy and AS markets during the operating day is probably a longer term proposition. It requires something like a separate hour ahead market, or perhaps a little bit more futuristically by letting demand bids clear the 5-minute markets and then allocating frequency regulation cost to loads based on their sub 5-minute deviations. Because this is a longer term change, it's important to consider design issues in the context of functions and responsibilities of future distribution system operators or DSOs. What kind of role would DSOs play in this more sophisticated demand side market design? The third issue for equivalent access and value is around compensation for local transmission and distribution value. For our storage resource, we want to be able to site it in areas of the distribution and transmission systems that are congested. The most valuable place for storage is going to be in a place that has load growth that will trigger distribution upgrades and also has transmission congestion. So it'll have high LMPs and high local RA resource adequacy cost. The most obvious example of these sorts of places is in load pockets like New York City and Long Island in New York. In these constrained areas, if the battery discharges during time periods when local demand is high, and the system is constrained, we reduce our local demand and our congestion costs. But being able to site storage in these areas ultimately requires that we compensate it on the basis of local value as a way to steer storage resources into the places where they have the highest value. Settling net injections from our storage resource at the substation LMP and its zonal capacity prices will address most of its transmission value, but the real question is how to compensate for distribution value. And this question is more specifically around how do we design time differentiated tariffs for distribution value? And unfortunately, there isn't a straightforward or simple answer to this question. Value on the distribution peak for a heavily loaded part of the distribution system could be the marginal cost of an upgrade or the cost of curtailing load, but at what point is that scarcity price going to be triggered? What the value should be off of the distribution peak when marginal costs are low to negligible is controversial because it gets into cost recovery issues around distribution and embedded cost. So most likely the distribution part of DER tariffs will be a heavily negotiated number, but just because it needs to be negotiated isn't a reason to not provide incentives for distribution value, which is effectively what many jurisdictions are doing right now. And as we get to this world of electrified transportation and heating, and the potential for adding significant levels of different distribution level energy storage, it's important to provide incentives for efficient use of the distribution system. Let's move on to regulatory equivalence. So the elephant in the room for regulatory equivalence is obviously the lack of a federal climate policy. And there are actually a large number of regulatory equivalence issues, but I'm just going to focus on congestion management here. The idea here is that we currently have two different universes that resources interconnect into. On the transmission system, beginning with New England in 1998, FERC precedent has always been that we don't plan or build for congestionless transmission systems in wholesale markets, meaning that interconnecting resources have the ability to come onto the system, even if they may create congestion and need to be redispatched. But on the distribution system, we essentially build for a congestionless systems. This is changing in some jurisdictions, and I'll clarify that in a second. But this asymmetry between the distribution and transmission systems leads to some regulatory awkwardness at the distribution transmission interface. We have something akin to guaranteed physical rights on the distribution system, but financial rights on the transmission system. This may be a little bit awkward and appears to have been a source of confusion for some states, but it's not totally incompatible. The larger issue is that resources connecting to the distribution system may need to wait and pay for upgrades that if they were connecting to the transmission system under similar circumstances, they would not need to wait and pay for. This ultimately creates a regulatory wedge between the distribution and transmission systems. Distribution utilities have been developing hosting capacity analyses as a way to steer developers to non-saturated areas of their distribution systems, but this deals with symptoms rather than the root problem. So the highest level question is, do we need to have nodal pricing at the distribution system to address this problem, to create more equivalent regulatory structures between the distribution and transmission systems for congestion management? I think the short answer is no. There are multiple ways to give market participants the option to come onto the distribution system, even if their output would need to be curtailed some of the time. The UK has been doing this since 2015 and is good reference for the US. Options there have included static curtailment through export limits, which some utilities in the US a growing number of utilities in the US are allowing, or dynamic curtailment through active control or dispatch of resources, which some utilities in the US are currently exploring. In a US regulatory context, though, as soon as we move to dynamic curtailment of multiple resources, we'll need to address the question of how distribution utilities will curtail in a non-discriminatory fashion. And I think this has three main implications. First is that this is probably what gets us to DSOs. The two main reasons to have a DSO are, number one, to do non-discriminatory distribution operations. In other words, to make sure that curtailment is fair. And number two, to do resource optimization and market settlement that incorporates distribution constraints. The first of these is probably more of a near-term priority. The second implication is that even for this first option, where we're just focusing on non-discriminatory curtailment, from a regulatory perspective, we may need to functionally unbundle distribution operations and create some form of an open access distribution tariff. There's more than one way to go about functional unbundling of distribution operations, and my guess is that this will look different in different states. The open access distribution tariff also doesn't need to be 2,000 pages long, and will also look different in different states, but at a minimum, it needs to lay out roles and responsibilities and provide transparency on when and how utilities will curtail resources. The third implication is that we need to rethink distribution planning. If we're going to be doing a lot of dynamic curtailment, at what point do we trigger distribution upgrades? What are our planning criteria? Do we use the same reliability, economic, public policy benefit cost evaluation framework that we do for the transmission system, or do we use something else? There's a lot more to think about with distribution planning and DSOs that I won't go into here. This is an area that's very ripe for some creative thinking. But all of this discussion suggests a stage approach to getting to regulatory equivalence for congestion management on distribution and transmission systems, starting with export limits in stage one, then moving to dynamic curtailment, functionally unbundled DSOs, open access distribution tariffs, and new approaches to planning in stage two. And then finally, at some point in stage three, market-based congestion management on the distribution system. I want to close this discussion by noting that the functional unbundling of operations, an open access distribution tariff, and similar regulatory requirements for investment planning are all part of this notion of regulatory equivalence between the distribution and transmission systems, creating similar institutions for congestion management on both. So what does all of this mean in terms of priorities for better integrating the distribution and transmission systems? I think there are two main categories of priorities. The first category is things that we should make observable progress on in the near term. These are the do nows. This includes tariffs for net injecting customers that are tied to wholesale prices and include locational value. Remember, the goal is to encourage resources to site where they have the most value, and we should design these tariffs thinking about a world where resources can be paired with at least some amount of storage. It also includes export limit options for distributed generation and storage, allowing resources to self-curtail rather than paying for distribution upgrades. And it includes a working group, maybe between NARUC and FERC, to sort out jurisdictional issues. We didn't talk a lot about jurisdictional issues, but it was implied in most of the discussion. Our current approach to tiptoeing around this jurisdiction issue doesn't really work. It means that different utilities within the same state can interpret whether a resource is FERC or state jurisdictional differently. We need to have more proactive conversations about jurisdiction and come up with more forward-looking consensus on what regulatory solutions might be for things like DSOs and open access distribution tariffs, rather than having this jurisdiction question be settled by the courts. Just starting this conversation, which I think would be the now part of this, would be really useful. The second category is things that we should start working on now that will probably take a while to do, but if we don't start now, they might either never happen or will be done hastily and turn out poorly. This includes starting to talk about ways to coordinate distribution and transmission planning with an aim of planning conversions. It includes setting up rules for dynamic curtailment and efforts to better understand what a DSO would actually do and how that might intersect with ISO market and operational processes. It includes the development of pro forma open access distribution tariffs for different kinds of DSOs. It includes the exploration of new planning criteria for distribution systems. And then lastly, it includes changes in ISO market rules to allow for a more active demand side. I think this probably means revisiting aggregated LMP settlement for loads to understand if this still makes sense in a world where we have a more active demand side. And it also implies exploring ways to allow more participation of loads through demand bids throughout the course of the day. And again, for this latter question, we should be thinking about it in the context of DSOs and the function of DSOs. So a quick summary to wrap things up. I started with the question of how can we make changes in regulation and markets that enable the distribution and transmission systems to function more like an integrated whole. I argued that we're in a unique period right now in which there's a lot of momentum behind localization and regionalization at the same time, and that these two trends aren't compatible in and of themselves, but we need to find ways to make them more compatible by enabling closer integration of the distribution and transmission systems. Laid out 4 principles aimed at achieving closer integration: equivalent in access and value, the notion that we should be able to site resources where and operate them how they have the most value; regulatory equivalence, the idea that regulation shouldn't unduly affect where we site resources; planning convergence, that our distribution and transmission planning should converge to consistent solutions; and autonomy, the idea that producers and consumers should be able to choose how they buy and sell power. Lastly, I identified some priority areas to work on for this integration topic, including the do nows, tariffs, export limits, and a jurisdiction working group, and the start nows, planning coordination, DSOs, open access distribution tariffs, distribution planning criteria, and market designs for a more active demand. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your time, and I think we'll move on to questions.
Thank you so much, Rich. That was an awesome presentation, and you covered a huge amount of ground. There's a lot of questions, and I think it would have been great if we could have done this in person. I'm going to take the chair's privilege and go into one area of what you discussed, which is the idea that demand bids in a price curve. And I think, all the economists in the room are, cheering you on, because that's what the economists in the room want. And I'm not an economist, but I do too. And I think you stated, you gave a bunch of brief comments that had a lot of depth behind them, such as the idea that, if we could do this, it's got a lot of advantages over demand response and treating demand as a generator and having to deal with the baseline problem. And maybe we should make demand pay for what it uses when it uses it. So one question is what do we need to do to get to that kind of reality? What do we need to do to make that happen? That solves a lot of problems, but what do we need to do?
So the evasive answer to this is, I think that we need a stakeholder process. There's several ways that one might design intraday participation, energy market participation by loads. And I think for this to work, there has to be a consensus solution that the ISOs are comfortable with in terms of reliability implications, and that market participants would be comfortable with in terms of their capabilities. So for instance, having the ability to do 5-minute load forecasting and to be able to live with the consequences of potentially being penalized for imbalances. So I think the evasive answer is a stakeholder process.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna turn over to Slido, and the top question is, who would have operational control over the distribution resources?
So I think there's several ways to potentially do this. I think there are utilities in the US that do not really want to be more active managers of their systems, in which case all they would really need to do to enable resources to participate in ISO markets on the supply side is to ensure that ISO market schedules aren't violating or aren't leading to reliability violations, and then to ensure that there's some sort of outage coordination with the ISO. That would be one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum would be having a DSO that effectively is acting as the market operator, and as it sort of aggregates bids for the ISO market, is incorporating distribution level constraints into those bids. And I think the full spectrum in between those models is probably possible in the US, even within the same ISO market.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question that says, you seem to imply all storage is battery only and located on the distribution side. Why are you ignoring grid-side storage and other storage types?
So that was unintentional, and I apologize. So when I meant to, storage could be any form of storage.
Okay. Another question says, you're assuming the LSC will increase engagement with the ISO. Why would they do that? What's the incentive to take on the responsibility and risk?
Great question. I think part of there are three potential answers to this question. I think part of this might be what one might call a cultural shift among LSCs. Just the idea that it's normal for LSCs to be more active participants in ISO markets. That would be the sort of cultural change driver of more active participation. There's also, given that most LSCs that we're talking about in a US context are regulated utilities, there's also for the potential for regulators to provide a better incentive structure to encourage utilities to be more active participants. And then I think the third option for this is and somewhat related to the first one, is just I hesitate to use the word herd mentality, but as utilities see other utilities doing it, then gradually and this is also, I guess, part of a culture shift, gradually then it becomes more normal for people to do that, for utilities to do this.
Thanks. I really liked what you said about the differentiation between value to customer or to community or to the overall system or the grid. And I would just mention, I was on a FERC conference yesterday where one of the panelists said that the value to the customer does not equate necessarily to the value to the grid. And to me, this is at the crux of a huge amount of our issues in this space. And Mahesh asks a question related to this. How does the fact that retail prices are regulated and wholesale prices are not, how does that make this more difficult? That, you know, it's hard to get these signals to the customer to reflect what you want it to reflect.
Great question. Let me see if I can come up with a short answer to this. So I think in some level, you know, at some level, I think it's fine if a state or a community decides we want a more decentralized electricity system. But then on the wholesale side, the wholesale value of that system as that community or that community sells power to the rest of the system has to reflect some common value that other people are buying it at. And that community essentially has to recognize, and I think this is the really challenging part, has to recognize our retail rates are going to be higher because we have these values. And that's just the way it's going to be. And I don't think, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I actually, you know, I think it's good for communities to have these individual values, but the challenge is then to make the system work as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Here's another question. Do we need new simulation tools to compare the value of resources on the distribution system versus the transmission system?
I think the short answer is probably yes. and so, I mean, at some level, a lot of the things, a lot of the distribution, you know, if you're evaluating a storage resource on the distribution system and you want to figure out, you know, where should I put this facility, you need to be able to account for a range of different values that simulation tools today don't capture. Real-time energy, maybe if you're going to be providing AAS, real-time versus day-ahead AAS, congestion value, and then distribution value as well. And I think that's, you know, it's a tall order. I don't think that means having simulation tools that can do everything. I think that means figuring out what among those things, if we're going to be looking at value, what are the most important things to look at? And how can we simplify the problem to make it tractable?
Okay, thanks. Another question asks, DSO and ISO congestion management and curtailment rules may be different. That leads to market inconsistencies. So yes, that's more of a comment.
They could be. There are ways to do this though, where the DSO and the ISO would have their own sets of rules for congestion management, but there's a way to they're sort of linked at the transmission distribution interface in the sense that what's showing up to the ISO at the transmission distribution interface is effectively a net bid from the DSO. And then to that extent, the ISO doesn't really care what's happening in the distribution system for congestion management. All it cares about is what's happening at the interface.
Okay. Someone asks, on integration principles, how do you balance? For example, community utility DERs on the distribution uses customer load, removing autonomy without increased system upgrades. Sorry, that's the question. I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding it myself. So for example, a DER on the distribution system, I guess maybe reducing customer load without increasing the need for system upgrades, I think is what they're talking about.
Well, in some way, let me see if I can understand this. So the question was, how does this work with the autonomy principle?
With the integration.
Oh, it's the integration principle. to me, this is kind of, at some level what we want is, if it makes sense for you to install store resources locally to offset your load, then, and especially if you're in a congestion part of the distribution system, then that's great. But I think the flip side of the autonomy principle is that you have to also accept the cost and risk responsibilities that go along with that. And so you're not being subsidized by other customers unless that's part of your community or state policy.
Okay. Russ Philbrook has a question. What prevents load serving entities from taking advantage of price differences, even without needing real-time bidding? Shouldn't prices drive a change in forecast response without bids?
Yes, and they do. So if LSCs know what the price forecasts are for 2 hours in the future, real-time price forecasts are for 2 hours in the future, then they can change their demand. And change the demand ideally shows up in the ISO forecast, and will reduce demand, and in some ways it'll have the same effect. The in between reality, though, is that it won't always be fast enough to show up in the ISO forecast. And their LSCs differ in how much they actually chase prices like this. So in some ways, this is my opinion, but in some ways I feel like it makes sense to formalize demand participation in the markets as a way to give more transparency to ISOs, rather than having the shadow load going around chasing prices in the background.
Another question asks, does the grand unification theory of T&D have economic inefficiencies to be addressed when there's negative wholesale and or distribution level power prices?
So for the negative wholesale, let me think about the inefficiency part of this. So ideally, when you have negative prices on, whether that's driven by just the flow, like your transmission flows and how and your transmission constraints and how your nodal pricing is working, or whether that's over generation at a local or system level. Ideally, those are the periods where you want storage devices to charge. So part of this is trying to get better match up what's happening in the distribution system, which is distribution level storage, please charge during hours when the system has excess generation, when the bulk system has excess generation, versus in the other end of the spectrum, when the system is constrained, when we're constrained locally, please discharge. But having that better coordination between the bulk and the distribution system is what I think we're aiming for.
Okay, thanks. There's another question. How could the services delivery of aggregated DERs be measured, which have measurement at each DER?
Okay, let me try to interpret this. So I think if this is referring to the how do we disaggregate aggregated DER that's participating in ISO markets for the purposes of the distribution system, I think at some level, and a couple of utilities are doing this. I think utilities will start asking for the individual data on individual resources in DERs. And at some point in the future, when you have very resource-rich distribution systems, I think this will make a lot of sense. But there'll be that need for disaggregating DERs. But I'm not sure that world is necessary. That it's necessary to be able to disaggregate DERs in the near term.
Okay, thanks. So I'm realizing that we're at the top of the hour, and we're going to need to wrap up. So Fritz, I want to thank you so much for a very informative presentation, very engaging. I think that there's a ton more questions on the slide that I know people had more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. We will send out an email once the video file gets posted. We'll answer the questions we didn't get to and get them posted. We appreciate everyone's engagement. For those of you who don't know, we've got the opening plenary session of the fall workshop. It's going to be online on Tuesday, October 5th at 3 p.m. is when the keynote starts. That's going to focus on grid forming inverters. And we hope that folks are able to join us for that or one of the future events. I should also mention there's a number of sessions and talks related to what Fritz just discussed during the workshop. There's going to be talks, for example, by the Australians on virtual power plants, Hawaiian Electric on their integrated grid planning, which is trying to get at this holistic T&D planning. Green Mountain Power and Arizona Public Service are going to talk about their efforts in this regard. A lot of talks about electric vehicle integration. So information on all of this can be found at ecig.energy on the web. And Fritz, thank you again. It was a really exciting, excellent, engaging webinar. Thanks to all of you participants for the interest, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. So thanks, everyone.